Warning, if you are mentally fragile, depressed, suicidal, or struggling with mental illness, do not listen to this episode. This episode may give you an existential crisis, depression, or suicidal thoughts. This episode may rob your life of meaning and purpose, cause mental instability, or lead to depersonalization. If you are into mainstream spirituality, this episode may piss you off. Welcome to the ultimate guide to solipsism. In this episode, you're going to get a definitive answer, a very clear-cut answer to the question of, is solipsism true? I'm not just merely interested here in discussing solipsism as a philosophical position that could or could not be true and leaving it up in the air. I'm going to give you a definitive answer, and I'm going to give you a method, a definitive method, a very scientific method for validating this answer for yourself so that you don't just believe me or take me on my word. And we're going to go through an exhaustive list of frequently asked questions, an FAQ, if you will, of just the common questions people have around this solipsism question. There are many, many different questions that people have. I get asked all the time on the forum and in the comments section, various kinds of questions. And so we're going to tackle all of these today. In fact, that's going to be the bulk of what this episode is just answers to common questions about solipsism and so forth. Before we get into that, though, let's sort of set the ground for the definition of what solipsism is. And for this, it's good to go to Wikipedia and just take a look at how it's defined. Because a lot of times people have sort of like an idea of solipsism, but they don't really think about what solipsism means. And then when they get the answer, they don't understand what the answer means. So here's what Wikipedia says solipsism is. Quote, solipsism, from the Latin solus, meaning alone, and ipsi, meaning self, is the philosophical idea that only one's mind is sure to exist. As an epistemological position, solipsism holds that knowledge of anything outside of one's own mind is unsure. The external world and other minds cannot be known and might not exist outside the mind. Metaphysical solipsism is a variety of solipsism, so it's a deeper version of solipsism, based on a philosophy of subjective idealism. Metaphysical solipsists maintain that the self is the only existing reality and that all other realities, including the external world and other persons, are representations of that self and have no independent existence. Furthermore, it says, the denial of material existence in itself does not constitute solipsism. A feature of the metaphysical solipsistic worldview is the denial of the existence of other minds. Since personal experiences are private and often considered ineffable, another being's experience can be known only by analogy. Some people hold that while it cannot be proven that anything independent of one's mind exists, the point that solipsism makes is irrelevant. This is because, whether the world as we perceive it exists independently or not, we cannot escape this perception, except via death. Hence, it is best to act assuming the world is independent of our minds. End quote. From the Wikipedia page on solipsism. So, before I give you the answer, first, what needs to be noticed about this issue is that mankind gives a very negative connotation to the term and the concept of solipsism. Have you noticed this? Notice this. And start to wonder why. And if you are like the majority of mankind, you give a negative connotation to solipsism. Notice that you're biased against solipsism. My question to you is, why? Contemplate that. Why do you assume it's bad? Why do you assume it's crazy? Why do you assume it's impossible? Why do you assume it's unscientific? And what I want you to notice, if you're very careful with introspecting, as we've talked about in my episode called Developing Introspection, if you become good at introspection, what you'll notice actually, if you examine the contents of your own mind on this topic, is that, in fact, having a bias against solipsism or giving solipsism as a worldview a negative meaning is, in fact, unscientific and irrational. There's nothing scientific about not liking solipsism. If solipsism is true, then that is what's true, regardless of whether mankind likes it or not, whether you like it or not, whether your mom likes it or not, whether some scientist likes it or not. It's irrelevant. And likewise, if solipsism turns out to be true, it's irrelevant that you think it's not logical or that it's improbable or that it's crazy. This is all irrelevant. If we're doing a real scientific investigation into the nature of reality, then we should be open to all possible worldviews, explore everything, get to the rock bottom of what reality is, and whatever that turns out to be, whatever the truth turns out to be, then our job is to just accept that, and that is what is true. You see? But the way that most people throw out that word solipsism, they use it in an accusatory manner, like, oh, well, that is very solipsistic. And so, that doesn't mean it's not true. What does that have to do with anything? You see, we're interested in truth. We don't care what your feelings about it are. And a lot of times people accuse me and my teachings of being very solipsistic in this sort of negative fashion, as though this is some sort of insult to me to call my teaching solipsistic. So anyways, be very honest with yourself about that. Notice if you have this sort of negative predisposition against solipsism. And then ask yourself, is that in line with the spirit of seeking truth? Or is just that some sort of personal bias that you have? See? Because if you were truly interested in the truth, it wouldn't matter to you that something is solipsistic as long as it's true. And if you, in fact, loved the truth, and then you discovered that solipsism was true, you would then fall in love with solipsism, if it's true. So the question is solipsism true? And how could you possibly ever know? There's a very big mistake that people make, which is that they assume that it's impossible to know. But furthermore, they don't just assume that it's impossible to know, they take it as an absolute fact that it's impossible to know. And that's a very dangerous position to take. The mind takes that position without realizing that it's actually taking that as an absolute position. And what's worse is that a lot of scientifically minded people, atheistically minded people, and rationally minded people will take an absolute position on this point, that it's impossible to know whether solipsism is true or not. Or even worse than that, they say it isn't. Solipsism isn't true. Really, the way we want to approach this question is that what are we really asking when we're asking, is solipsism true? What we're really asking is, we're asking about the nature of other. There is self and there is other. Other as being anything that's not the self. So if whatever you take yourself to be, if you take yourself to be this human, then other is defined relative to that to mean everything other to you. It's sort of the inverse of your self-definition. And so the question really becomes, what is other? Well, to answer that question, you also have to know what is self, because self and other are interdefined as inverses of each other, like convex and concave. To know what concave is, you have to know what convex is, and vice versa. It's a duality. So in spiritual work, usually we frame the question as, what is the self? What am I? Who am I? And we do self-inquiry to get to the bottom of what the self is. That's one direction to go. That's the most common direction that people go in spiritual work as they're trying to awaken. But then there's a sort of a other direction, the inverse direction, which most people ignore. They don't think about very deeply. And that direction is, what is other? Have you contemplated that? How seriously have you contemplated that? Or do you just take for granted this notion of other, what other is? And see, if you haven't seriously gotten to the bottom, to the rock bottom of what other is, if you don't know the truth of what other is, then how can you even be sure that other is real or other exists? See, you have to be open to the possibility that you don't know what other is. And if you don't know what other is, your lack of knowing about it can be so profound that it might be the case that other doesn't even exist. What if, because other and self are so interdefined, that given how you've defined yourself leads to a co-arising definition of other, and that if you expand or change your sense of self and your identity, then that will also change your understanding of other. And furthermore, open your mind to the possibility that if you expand your sense of identity or self to become infinite or absolutely total and all-inclusive, then that will literally leave no more room for other, and other may cease to exist as it collapses into yourself. And then all you'll be left with is yourself. But this will be a radically different notion of self than you and most of your compatriots have, because this would be a sense of self that is so large that it includes everything that you previously considered to be other. Now, the problem here is that even though I say this, and you might be somewhat open to the things I'm saying here, to these possibilities, the problem is that you're not grasping the depth of these possibilities and their consequences, very radical consequences, because your mind will tend to take this as just a word game. It's like, well, Leo, okay, yeah, I can play with my definitions of self and other, but these are just like conceptual things, right? Like, what difference does it make? It doesn't change what reality is, right? Well, if it was just a word game, I wouldn't be spending all this time talking about it. So clearly, we're doing this work because it's not just a word game. Something deeper is being said. So anyways, that's just to open your mind. I'm not gonna withhold from you anymore. So is solipsism true? The answer is yes. But I have some explaining to do about what that actually means. And in fact, it means something more radical than whatever you think it means. So most people object to solipsism, and they say it's not true because if it was true, they think it's too crazy, too wacky, too radical. But the truth is that you can become directly conscious of what other is, and also of what self is. And then when you finally get to the rock bottom of what other is, you're going to discover that other is your own self, your own mind. And the consequences of this are so radical that they will shake you to your core. And they will lead to a radical recontextualization of all of reality and all of experience for you. And this is a very serious thing. It's no mere wordplay. And so my job is to help to guide you towards that. Now, this is tricky and difficult and even dangerous to do, because most people don't appreciate just how much emotional investment they have in the concept of other being real. Your entire life hinges on this. Your entire sense-making apparatus, how you make sense of reality, hinges on a sense of other. Even all of your scientific theories and scientific explorations, and all of your logic and all your rationality, it all hinges on a notion of other, which is taken for granted as being real. This sense of other sits at the very core of your psyche, not just psychologically, but deeper than that, existentially. And it's deeply interwoven with your sense of self and your identity, such that to take away from you, to rob you of a notion of other, will lead to a collapse of your entire mind and your sense of reality, because your sense of reality is tied in with your sense of self and your sense of other. But because we just assume that self and other and reality just are the way we think they are, we take all of that for granted, the possibility isn't even open in our minds that such a radical breaking down of these boundaries can happen, and it's impossible for us to even imagine what the consequences of that would be for our life. So I've actually held back for about a year now shooting this episode on solipsism. It's been an often asked question on the forums and elsewhere. I get asked about it all the time, and I've given answers to it, kind of one-on-one to people. But I've held back. The reason I've held back is because I've been trying to investigate and really double check, and not just double check, but like check over and over and over again that my understanding of this issue is correct. Because the potential for misleading people here is so grave that I didn't want to record this episode a year ago and then come up with new conclusions, a year later. I really wanted to make sure that I was very solid on what I was going to teach here. And so I held off for about a year or so, checking over and over and over and over and over again in my contemplations, in my awakenings, in my spiritual work, just verifying. I've verified not just a handful of times, but dozens of times, maybe even 50 times, because I wanted to be damn sure not to mislead people on this point. And so recently I've reached a new level of awakening. I know you guys are sick of me saying that, but honestly, I've reached a level of awakening that is unimaginable and that shook me to my core. And I don't even tell you guys anymore about the new crazy levels of awakening that I reached, because there's no way for you guys to understand it. So I don't even talk about it. The only reason I'm talking about it now in the context of this episode is because I just want to explain to you the amount of work that goes in. I'm not just sitting around and just building some philosophical scheme in my own mind and then teaching it to you. A lot of direct experience and a lot of work goes into these things that I talk about. And so anyways, I reached a level of awakening so profound that all sense of other for me collapsed completely. To the point where I became absolutely conscious that I'm the only conscious thing in existence. And that's what awakening ultimately is. You become so conscious that, of course, you realize that you're God. But then you become more conscious of what God really is. Because see, you can become conscious that you're God and all this. You can become conscious of no self. You can become conscious of love and so forth. but then you can still have remnants of your old worldview and your old life, of your old mind still present. And those remnants will include subtle notions of other. And so what's possible is that you can awaken, have some kind of degree of awakening, realize God and love and so forth, but then you can still hold out the idea that, well, but there's other minds out there. I'm not conscious of them, but there could be other minds out there beyond my own, and that we're all just part of a larger God's mind. See? And a lot of people treat awakening in this way. But if you awaken beyond that even, you become so conscious that your consciousness becomes completely absolute. This means that you're conscious of absolutely everything that there is. Everything. Now, you might say, well, Leo, but haven't you already confirmed this before? I mean, you have old episodes from years ago where you talk about this kind of stuff. So what's new here? Well, there's nothing really anything new here. It's just a larger sense of completeness and wholeness. And also just that, like I said, I've re-verified this now probably over 50 times to make sure that it's accurate. So it's not new. It's just that I've verified it a lot in ever deeper and deeper ways. And I mean, this is how science works too. It's like, at first you do an experiment, you get some result, and sometimes the result is kind of a crazy, wacky result. And you're like, wait a minute, that can't be right. Let me just double check. Let me do that experiment again. And so you do it again, and you get the same result. But the result is so radical that it's like, no, it still can't be right. Because if this is right, it contradicts all of science. So you do it a third time, and you do it a fourth time. And the question becomes, how many times do you do it until finally you go, okay, all of science is wrong then, because this result keeps coming up the same. Now, this is somewhat of a subjective matter. You know, do you do it 10 times, 20 times, 50 times, 1,000 times? How many times do you got to do it before you feel confident coming out there and telling the public, this is what it is? Of course, that's a very subjective boundary. Everyone will have their own different standards. I've actually been very careful about this because I've been wanting to record this episode for, like I said, over a year now, but I've held back. So anyways, when you truly understand what God is and yourself to be God, you identify with God ever deeper until your identification with God becomes so complete and so direct that you're absolutely conscious of everything. You're conscious of everything as being your own self, your own mind. And you have absolute consciousness. And what that means is that there can not be anything outside of your own consciousness. And you're absolutely conscious of this. And at this point, you're absolutely conscious that you're completely alone. And the reason it has to be this way is because God's mind is absolutely one, and it's completely sovereign, which means that everything has to be present within God's consciousness. There can't be anything outside of God's mind or outside of God's consciousness, because God's mind is infinite. And because it's all-seeing and all self-knowing. It's a complete self-recognition. It's a complete self-understanding. And so when you realize that, you're too conscious for any sense of other to remain. So actually what a sense of other is it's something that God's mind, your mind, is constructing in order to create the illusion of something other than your own mind. So within God's mind, there can be partitions that you can trick yourself into believing are something other than you. Other minds. You paint subtle imagery in your mind of like, well, my mom has her own mind, my dad has her own mind, my dog has its own mind, there are aliens out there with their own minds, there are computers that are maybe conscious with their own minds, and so on. But what you're not conscious of is that you constructed all those minds within your own mind. And furthermore, you're in denial about that. You see? And so it takes an enormous degree of consciousness, way beyond a standard awakening, to become conscious of what other is. So it's actually relatively easy to awaken to the fact of no self, or even to recognize yourself as God. That's all easy stuff compared to the higher awakenings of becoming fully conscious of what other is and how you construct other. And it's also a lot more threatening and emotionally difficult than it is to merely recognize no self and to recognize God or to recognize love. Those are all easy, emotionally speaking, compared to the kind of existential crisis that you will have when you realize what other is. In other words, you're going to realize that other is just your own construction. And the reason that is so emotionally difficult is that you're going to be left completely alone. You are the only conscious thing in existence. There cannot be any other conscious being but you. That's what you are. There are not multiple conscious beings out there. There are not souls. There are not parallel lives that are being lived. There's not a past life and an afterlife. There's only your mind right now. Your mind right now, what you're seeing, hearing, feeling, tasting, smelling, thinking, imagining, that's all that exists. That's what existence is. Nothing more, nothing less, precisely that. You have 100% direct, absolute consciousness of existence. The mistake you're making is that you're imagining things that need to underpin this precise experience that you're having right now. You need to imagine things behind the scenes. You need to imagine your parents. You need to imagine animals. You need to imagine history. You need to imagine atoms. You need to imagine science. You need to imagine all of that stuff to explain the present moment. Otherwise, you'd have no explanation for the present moment. And so you keep dreaming that up. So that's what God is. God is an infinite mind that keeps dreaming up for itself an infinite chain of backstories to rationalize the present moment. And in this way, it creates a life for itself. It creates its dream. And outside of this dream, there's nothing and no one. And this mind is singular, and it's the only conscious thing that there is. And that mind is you. You are the only conscious thing that there is. And there will never be anything other than you, forever. That's awakening. That's solipsism. Now, there's some common mistakes that come with the sort of mainstream notions of solipsism. The mainstream notions of solipsism don't include notions of God, typically, and love, and infinite consciousness, and some of these other things that I'm talking about. So really what I'm talking about here is I'm talking about absolute solipsism. Solipsism as an absolute. The other problem with solipsism, as it's conventionally conceived, is that usually the person who's thinking about solipsism and denying it is coming from a materialist paradigm. So they have that as their background set of assumptions in their worldview. Materialism, also duality, is part of their paradigm, whether they realize it or not. And also their ego mind, is fully in control of that entire scheme. So they're thinking about solipsism from materialism, dualism, and their ego mind. And then so when I say that you are God or that you are the only thing that exists, it's like the ego mind can take that idea and say, oh, okay, so I, as the ego mind, is the only thing that exists. Like my human self is the only thing that exists. But that's not what's being said. Your human self is part of the construction. But what is being said is that your visual field, this bubble of consciousness that you are experiencing right now, that's the only thing that there is. There's nothing outside of your bubble of consciousness. Of course, it's not just the visual field. This includes the physical, tactile sensations you have, the emotions. All of this is part of your field of consciousness. Smells, sounds, thoughts, images in your mind, mental imagery, all of that. And that's it. That's all that ever exists. That's all that ever has existed. That's all that ever will exist. And what's more, you can know this absolutely. So this is not a speculation. This is not something you sit around in an armchair theorizing about and trying to convince yourself of. This is something you awaken to and you become absolutely conscious of. So an awakening is required to become conscious of this. And not just any awakening, but profound degrees of awakening beyond what most awakened people have awoken to. So you got to go very deep on this, to the point where you're absolutely conscious of everything. And when that happens, you'll realize that this is all there is. And that, of course, there can't be any other mind but your own, because your mind is absolute. And that is what reality is. That's what life is it's a dream dreamt up for an audience of one. There's only one audience. There's only one entity that needs to be fooled to construct reality. And that entity is you. And as long as that entity is being fooled by its own self, then it's dreaming up a reality, and it believes in this reality full of others and an external world. But as that entity awakens to its own self, it becomes conscious of how it's constructing all those others and the external world, and then it realizes that those were just dissociations of itself, split off portions of its own mind. That mind, this infinite mind, reintegrates those parts of itself until it becomes completely whole and absolute, sovereign, one. And then it realizes what it actually is. And what it is precisely what appears before it and nothing else. And it also recognizes that there are no other minds but the one absolute mind that you are. So that's reality. That's the self. That's awakening. That's solipsism. That's God. Now you say, but Leo, this is crazy and it's impossible. It can't possibly be true. What kind of sick, twisted God would create a world like this? Why? Why would reality be structured in this way? Why wouldn't there be a real reality? Why wouldn't there be a external world? Why wouldn't there be other minds? But if you think about it more deeply, why would there be? Actually, this design that I'm laying out for you, this is the most elegant and intelligent design. If you think about the question of how do you get reality at all? Where does reality come from? How is reality created? This is a very profound question that you should contemplate seriously. Most people don't contemplate it. Even most scientists and philosophers don't seriously contemplate it because they take for granted all sorts of different things as existing without realizing that they need to be created first. So how do you create anything at all from scratch? You think, well, you'd have to make some atoms first. You'd have to make some physical forces. Maybe you need to invent mathematics first. No, that's not how it works. The way it works is that you need to dream up self and other and an external world and things outside yourself. And then you need to deny all this, and you need to fool yourself that you didn't create it. So this infinite mind creates itself and creates its own world, but it needs to deny that it's doing so in order to buy into the illusion. So the question is here, how do you create a sense of other? How does reality create a sense of other? Think about that. That's a profound existential question. You might say, well, Leo, a sense of other is like, one animal is born, that's one self, and another animal is born, that's another self, and they're other to each other. That's obvious. But it's not obvious, because you're begging the question, you're taking for granted the notion of otherness. Even if you have multiple animals that are being born, who says they're not all the same self? Who says that they're other to each other? You see, you can't take that for granted. And science can't tell you what other is. There's no scientific instrument that you can point at an elephant and then at your own body. You point this little radar thing at an elephant and it says, oh, that's other. And then you point it at yourself and it says, that's self. And then you point one at your mom and it says, oh, that's other. Mom is other than self. And then you point one at something else and then you point one at your finger and it says, oh, that's self. You see, there's no such scientific instrument, nor could there ever be such a scientific instrument, because in fact, these are all completely relative distinctions and categories which don't actually exist. They're inventions of your own mind. And when you become really conscious, you realize that if such an instrument was invented and you pointed it, and it was a truthful instrument, you pointed at all the different objects in the world, what that instrument would read all the time is just self. Self, 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 self. Everything you look at would come out self. And if it didn't, the instrument is faulty. And that's exactly what the human mind is. It's this kind of instrument, but it's a finite instrument. It's faulty. It's self-biased. So it's looking around the world. It's categorizing self as this, but not that and not that. And then from this, all sorts of problems result. So actually, if you think about it, of all the different possible ways that reality could be designed, the most ingenious and most intelligent design solution is just simply, rather than creating a bunch of different creatures who have consciousness and creating atoms and which come up together and make molecules, and those molecules form neurons, those neurons form synapses, and those somehow generate some sort of cloud of consciousness, and then within that cloud of consciousness, there's some sort of perceptions and stuff, and having multiple millions and billions and trillions of these different clouds of consciousnesses all interconnecting with each other and working together. This is sort of the scientific model of how reality is constructed. Rather than having all of that, all you need to do is just have one consciousness which fools itself with images of something outside of itself, other minds, other consciousnesses. And that's it. This is the most genius and the most beautiful design for reality possible. It's also the most efficient, because you don't need to construct a bunch of atoms, trillions and trillions and trillions of atoms and planets and stars and multiverses and different minds and different organisms and all of this. You don't need any of that. All you need is one mind that dreams up everything else. It's like a stage set for a camera. For one camera. There's only one camera, and if you position that camera just perfectly within the frame of the stage, then you don't need to render anything outside the frame. Like in a video game, In a video game, frame rate is a very important metric. And computer programmers have to optimize the shit out of video games to get them to run at 60 frames a second or 120 frames a second or whatever the latest fastest rate is to get the smoothest, best performance. And the way they do that is by culling every possible thing that doesn't need to be rendered in the scene and in the frame out. So the video game world doesn't exist anywhere. And all the characters in the video game, they don't exist anywhere. A video game is just the current frame that is being displayed. That's what a video game is. It's a current frame. That's the most efficient design. Why would you need anything outside the current frame? Because all the player ever sees is the current frame. In fact, all the designer sees is the current frame. When a designer is conceiving a video game, he's only ever seeing that video game in his own mind one frame at a time. There's only one frame. It's how the game looks. That's it. And everything else is just in service to that one frame. But then there's one extra master stroke of genius that is involved in actually the way that reality is constructed versus how video games are constructed. The way a video game is constructed is that programmers and designers come up with a bunch of tools and other things and code and, XML files and other databases that are behind the scenes that are sourcing the frame and are in service to the one frame that is being rendered. So it might seem like the video game world has a bunch of different objects and files and databases and spreadsheets and other things that are feeding it. And that is sort of, you might say, like the substrate of the video game world. You might even say there's code, there's lines of code, which is like more fundamental than the frame itself. But see, the master stroke to how an infinite mind constructs reality is that it realizes that it doesn't need anything behind the scenes at all. And that in fact, the most optimal and energy efficient way to construct reality is to simply have a frame. And that frame, that one frame, is all of the data already folded into it. So the frame itself is the code, it is the database, it is the spreadsheets, it is the level designer, it is everything. The frame is that. And there's nothing underneath the frame. There's nothing sourcing the frame. There's not a mainframe computer in which the frame exists. There's not code. There's not mathematics behind the frame. There's not some other place that the data is being sourced from. There's just the frame. You see, because you can't really avoid the existence of something. You have to posit the existence of something at some point. So if you say that the frame is not base reality, you say, well, the frame has some other more fundamental reality underneath it that's sourcing it. Okay, well, fine. Let's just say that. Let's say the frame is not the real thing. Let's go to the real thing then. Let's go to the source. The source then is what? Computer code or something like that, you'd say, or some database or some computer or some hardware, silicon chip or whatever. Okay, but then what's the reality of that thing? You see? You're just pushing the problem down one level, you see? And you might say, well, but the silicon chip, it's made out of atoms or something, and you push it down one more level. You say, well, the silicon chip isn't really real. It's just a collection of atoms. It's just sort of like a epiphenomena of the actual atoms that are there. That's what's real. And then you say, okay, well, so then we have to take that atoms are actually real. That atoms are base reality. So you look at that and you say, well, okay, so what is the atom? So no matter how low you go, at some point you have to bite the bullet of there being something. There has to be being there. And that being has to be absolute. So this is what science doesn't recognize. So see, rather than having this chain of different base realities, one more real than the other, that each kind of buttress each other and support each other, rather than playing this never-ending game of chasing your tail, actually what an infinite mind does is it just says, why do I need that? It's just as hard for me to create, or rather, it's just as easy for me to create the top level frame as it is to go through this chain of stuff and get to some rock bottom thing like an atom and create an atom. See, what you have to recognize is that from the point of view of an infinite mind, of universal mind, there's no difference between creating an atom versus creating an elephant. They're both equally easy to create. If you can create an atom, you can create an elephant. If you can create an atom, you can create a VR simulation that's running without a computer. You see, there's no limits to what an infinite mind can construct or imagine. So why is it going to make itself go through all these hoops in order to create something? It doesn't need to go through all these hoops. It can just create whatever it wants directly. So if it wants to create a human life, it doesn't need to create atoms and then molecules and then cells and neurons and connect them into a brain. It doesn't need to do all that. It doesn't need to create a history. It doesn't need to create time or space. It doesn't need to create the Big Bang. It doesn't need to create an Earth that existed for 4 billion years with 4 billion years of evolution. It doesn't need to do all that. It can just imagine a human life, which is what it's doing right now, imagining this human life, and that's it. It needs nothing behind the scenes. It doesn't need evolution. It doesn't need physics. It doesn't need mathematics. It doesn't need anything. It can just imagine a human life. And then, in order to maintain that illusion of a human life, then it has to imagine and invent a chain of causations and stories. Evolution, history, biology, chemistry, physics, time, space, whatever. It has to do all that in order to justify this frame. And the reason it invents those things is because it itself is asking the question, where did I come from? You see? The only reason you have stuff like biology, chemistry, physics, time, space, history, evolution, all this, is because the mind that you are, remember back to when you were born as a human, the mind that you are is started asking questions. Where did I come from? What is this? You look at your body and you ask, what is this? You looked at the room around you and said, what is this? Where am I? And then you started filling in the blanks. It's like, well, I'm in a house. You walked out of the room, you saw, oh, it's a house. Then you look down on the ground and you say, oh, this is planet Earth. And then people showed you pictures of a round planet. And then you ask, well, but where did I come from? And your parents told you, we gave birth to you at a hospital. And they maybe showed you some baby pictures. See, and this was filling in the blanks in your mind of where you came from. This is the backstory. You were constructing this backstory all along. And then you opened some biology books, and the biology books told you that your body's made of cells and atoms and so forth, and then you believe that. And then you opened some history books, and the history books told you that, before your parents were born, your grandparents, they were in World War II. And before World War II, there was World War I. And before that, there was the, ancient empires, the Greeks and Romans. And so you keep asking the question, where did I come from? And you keep pushing the question back one step all the time in all directions, whether it's in the physics domain, in the biology domain, in the chemistry domain, in history, or whatever. See? And then you needed the theory of evolution, you needed the Big Bang, you needed to go to some sort of cosmology to explain where you came from. And so as a child, your mind was being fed with all of this. You weren't thinking about it very deeply, and you were constructing your psyche and reality at the same time. And really what you were doing is you were constructing a backstory for this current frame that is here right now. And of course, you populated that frame and your whole backstory with the idea of other. And you gave your authority away. You literally gave your mind away to these imagined others that you constructed, to your parents, various other kinds of authority figures, spiritual teachers of yours, professors, authors you respected, scientists, intellectuals, people you looked up to. You gave away your authority and autonomy and sovereignty, your absolute sovereignty as an infinite mind. You gave that away to all these other pseudo minds that you invented within your own mind. You gave away most of your authority to them, and you let them define for you what reality is. You let your elementary school teacher teach you about history, and you integrated that into your psyche and your understanding of yourself, reality, and other. And then you let your parents tell you about your ancestry and your lineage, your grandparents and great-grandparents, where they came from, cultures and customs that you picked up. You integrated that, and you made that part of your identity and your psyche. And then your friends, and then your culture, it told you where the culture came from. There's a collective history of your culture that you were indoctrinated into, imprinted with. And then you went to university, and your university professors told you a bunch of complicated mumbo jumbo about where all of reality came from quarks or from strings or from some Big Bang. And then you believe that. And they told you about evolution, and you believe that. And the reason you believed all that is because you gave your authority away to all these different people. Because you thought that, well, all of these people, surely they know better than I do. I'm just this ignorant child who was born. What do I really know? Surely these people around me must know what's really going on. But then again, weren't they also born in positions of total ignorance like you? So how would they know what's going on? But you just assume that they know that adults know what's going on. And so you did all this, and now you're sitting here and you're feeling comfy, like you got this sense of reality. You're sitting here on Earth in this universe that has been evolving for 14 billion years since the Big Bang, through a process of evolution, all this, this is your backstory. And you think this backstory is reality. But what if you're just dreaming up that entire backstory? Think about it. Isn't the following thing that I'm about to say absolutely true? Isn't it absolutely true that you are all that you've ever experienced in your entire life? Think about it. Before you were born, there was nothing. Then you were born, and all you ever experienced up to this point, and you've probably been alive for 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years, up to this point, the only thing you've ever experienced are your own visual phenomena, auditory phenomena, bodily sensations and feelings, emotions, thoughts, mental images, tastes, smells, and that's it.